We've seen a number of the is functions, and we can see them in action now, checking for errors, which is the bulk of their use. So ISERR, ISERROR, ISNA are all checking for problems. So if we take the errors file, we'll find we have two sheets in here, div-o and NA. The first sheet, div-o, takes our standard fruit with a sales total, a sales quantity and an average, which is actually the sales total divided by the sales quantity. If, however, we actually have no data for sales quantity for the pairs, we get an error message of div-o because we're trying to divide by 0. So to negate that problem, what we ought to do is check to see if there's an error first. So instead of just saying B2 divided by C2, we're going to, in a separate cell so we can see a different result, check if ISERR, so is there an error in doing the sales total divided by sales quantity. So if it's true that there is an error doing that, then we're going to output a little hyphen. You can output an empty cell by just putting two sets of speech marks, but I'm not keen on an empty cell because it looks like there's nothing there, when in fact there is actually a formula behind the cell. So I'm just going to put a little hyphen. If it's false, however, so therefore there is no error, then we'll actually go ahead and do the sales total divided by the sales quantity. So the formula's a little bit longer, but the benefit is that we don't get that awful div-o there. We get a simple little hyphen. If we just do a bit of formatting, then the numbers will look exactly the same. When the sales quantities are there, the numbers are the same. When they're not, we get a trendy little hyphen instead of an awful hash div-o. So if another one of these were removed, we'd just get the little hyphen. So that's using the ISERR, so is there an error, to check a formula. If there is an error, output something else, in this case just a hyphen. If there isn't an error, then we output the actual result. Now looking at sheet 2, called NA, this is a lookup, and we're looking up the average price of the fruit mentioned down the left in this little table over here. And we're also looking up the highest price, so there's another VLOOKUP in this table over here. If, however, we type a fruit that does not exist, tomato for example, then we get hash NA as an error message because tomato does not exist in the list. So let's rebuild the average price, but with an if to check if there's an error. So equals if ISERR. What we've noticed before when we looked at ISERR is it does not check for NA. So the ISERR will actually be no use in this case. We need to use the ISERROR statement because that checks for NAs, open brackets. Then we can ask it to check our VLOOKUP. So we're looking up that value there in this table here, returning column 4, which is a false because it has to be an exact match. Close the round bracket for the ISERROR. So if that ISERROR produces an error, then we'll do like before. We'll simply put a little hyphen. Else, if it's false, therefore it's not an error, we'll go ahead and do the VLOOKUP. That's a VLOOKUP of that value, looking in that table, returning column 4 as an exact match. Close the round bracket for the VLOOKUP, close the round bracket for the if, and we get a hyphen for tomato. Before I can replicate this formula, I just need to make absolute two ranges, and then I can replicate. And we see that the others happily work themselves out, and they match the average price column, except where it's not applicable, and we get a little hyphen. So if I were to change that particular strawberry also to tomato, I get the trendy little hyphen instead of hash NA. So we've used ISERR and ISERROR to pick up the error messages there, and then produce a little hyphen or the actual result. Now, if what you're doing is checking for errors, there is actually another function that can do both these things in one go. So instead of doing an if and then running ISERROR, we can actually use an IFERROR statement. So let's do that on the div-o first. The advantage to an IFERROR statement is we're not having to repeat ourselves. By that, what I mean is if we have a look here, we're running the ISERR around our little function, but then if it's not an error, we're having to repeat the function. If that's the case, then you would be better using the IFERROR function. So that's equals IFERROR. So that's all one function name. My value is my formula. So that's the sales total divided by the sales quantity. If that produces an error, then I can output my little hyphen, close brackets. So effectively, I'm asking the question and producing the result at the same time. I'm not having to ask the question about the value of a formula and then return that formula if we're false. So if there's an error, when B2 is divided by C2, simply put a hyphen. Let's just format that so it's the same and then replicate. And you see the result here is exactly the same in that cell there as it is in that cell there, but the formula is a lot shorter. When we use our VLOOKUP, that formula can become even shorter. So here, if we use the if error, then we've got equals if error, open brackets, my value, so that's my formula. That's where my VLOOKUP goes. So I'm VLOOKING up that value there in this table here. Bringing back the fourth column has to be an exact match. Otherwise, if that produces an error, then let's output our trendy little hyphen and close brackets. Now just look how much shorter that formula is than the one next to it, and it produces exactly the same result. So instead of doing an if with an is error statement within it that will check what we've asked it to check and produce a hyphen if not, but then we have to tell it what to output if it isn't an error, we simply replace that with an if error that will check the formula and output a hyphen if it's an error, and if not, it will actually carry out the formula. So there's no need for that double repetition, which in itself can cause the opportunity for mistakes. So if error, fantastic little formula. Let's make that absolute before we copy the formula down and see that it produces the exact same results as the column next to it, but for much shorter syntax.